You are about to experience Jackson Snyder Presents, direct from the Vero Essin Yahad, a Hebrew Nation radio original program. JSP is a variety show seeking out Jewish and Christian origins, religion, theology, and history, and doing so in a fashion that is both educational and entertaining. Welcome to Jackson Snyder Presents.
The cursing of the Pharisees, Matthew 23. Why is Matthew so mad? 7 times in one chapter, that is chapter 23, Yahshua curses the scribes and Pharisees as hypocrites and blind guides. This occurs after numerous disputes with leaders of the Jewish community in Galilee and a series of confrontations with the authorities in Jerusalem. Finally, Matthew's Jesus mounts a climatic attack on his opponents, castigating them in a vitriolic, though coherent and comprehensive, series of charges intended to undermine their program for the Jewish community and their legitimacy as leaders. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! That's the refrain. You blind fools! You serpents! You brood of vipers! The language of the gospel is neither charitable nor politically correct. The author's charges that the scribes and Pharisees are corrupt murderers uninterested in justice and mercy strike post-Holocaust Christians seeking to correct the deadly legacy of anti-Semitism as embarrassingly offensive at best and virulently dangerous at worst. And for Jews, well, anti-Jewish attacks by Christians are an old and dangerous story. Students of antiquity will recognize Matthew's attack against his opponents as a robust example of the less than admirable genre of religious polemic. Vilification and misrepresentation of the opposition serves to establish the identity and boundaries of the polemicist group and weaken the power and attraction of the opposing group. But is historical distance and ancient practice enough for understanding the Gospel of Matthew? Christian theological interpreters of the Gospel will be torn by the contradictions in the text. The author composed the Sermon on the Mount as an admirable exhortation to a life of love and justice, as a summary of the attitudes and behavior expected of members of the Jesus movement. Matthew's Jesus instructs the crowd to rejoice and be glad when people persecute you, and to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Elsewhere, he describes Yahshua, using a passage from Isaiah, as one who will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick. How can the reader reconcile these passages with the intemperate curses against the scribes and Pharisees? Why this vicious and contorted text? The easy answer connects Matthew's curses of the scribes and Pharisees to the long history of Christian anti-Semitism. Christians have attacked Jews unjustly and mercilessly for nearly 2,000 years, having learned to do so partly from such passages as Matthew 23, as well as from other New Testament writings. But was Matthew really a Christian attacking those Jews? The majority of interpreters date the Gospel of Matthew to the late 1st century, somewhere between 80 and 95. Its author had been born a Jew, but became a follower of Yahshua. According to this theory, the author wrote the Gospel soon after his group of followers separated from the synagogue, that is, from the community of religious Jews. That schism, so this theory goes, had been so acrimonious and painful that the Gospel of Matthew was composed to justify the withdrawal of the author and his group and to vilify the position of their opponents who had expelled them. My view's different. I believe the author of this gospel and his group not only still considered themselves Jews, but also were considered Jews by their contemporaries. In short, the Matthean group saw themselves as part of the people of Israel, not as a new religion, or certainly not as Christians rather than Jews. Understood in this way, the author of Matthew attacked the scribes and Pharisees to delegitimize rival Jewish leaders and to legitimate himself and his group as the true leaders of Israel, the accurate interpreters of the Bible and the authentic messengers of Elohim's will. The warrant for this interpretation lies in the life and teachings of Yahshua as presented in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew doesn't present Yahshua as God in the manner of later Christian Trinitarian theology. Instead, he draws on designations and titles from Jewish scriptures, what Christians would later call the Old Testament. Thus, Matthew tells us that Yahshua was sent to Israel by Elohim as anointed leader, or Messiah, as the term is rendered in Psalm 2:2, as the Son of Man, as in Daniel 7, and Son of Elohim, as in 2 Samuel 7:14, and also Psalm 2:7. Matthew accords Yahshua a very high status, but he doesn't say that Yahshua is God. Rather, Matthew writes as a member of the late 1st century Jewish community, using the words, symbols, and thought patterns of his age in an attempt to establish Yahshua's way of life as the authentic way of living the Jewish tradition. Let me be clear about the distinction I'm drawing. I'm not turning the so-called Christian Matthew into a Jew or trying to deny the integrity of later Jewish and Christian communities. I'm denying that there were two communities with sharply defined boundaries in Matthew's geographical area at the time the gospel was written. Thus, Matthew couldn't have become a good Christian because he didn't have this word or that understanding of Elohim, Israel, and church that stands behind the concept Christian. Rather, the author of Matthew's Gospel was a Jewish leader and teacher who led a group of 1st century Jews. His group, like many other Jewish groups in the late 1st century, had its own understanding of the Bible, Jewish traditions, and the will of Elohim. With 2nd century hindsight, we may call Matthew Christian, but in the 1st century, he was part of the large and diverse world of the Jewish community. My interpretation of Matthew requires a new understanding of both Jewish communities and Christian communities in the 1st century. Neither so-called Christianity nor Judaism was a unified whole, as we are often taught in Sunday school. True, by this time Paul had recruited many Gentiles to accept the biblical Elohim and Yahshua as Elohim's son. But this doesn't mean that by the late 1st century, all Christian communities knew of and accepted Paul's teaching. Distance and difficulty of communication guaranteed that groups who believed in Yahshua would be diverse in traditions, customs, and outlooks. As New Testament documents themselves testify, early followers of Yahshua had many different experiences and beliefs. We can't retroject a later orthodoxy onto the 1st century. The same kinds of variations can be seen in Jewish groups in the 1st century. After the Roman destruction of the temple in 70, the rabbinic or Talmudic way of living Judaism took several centuries to develop and mature. Prior to that orthodox synthesis of later, Jews understood, interpreted, and lived their traditions in many ways, as they do today. And I might say, as the Hebrew roots people do today. Many different interpretations, many different traditions. They are certainly not united, and perhaps they shouldn't be. In the late 1st century, the rabbis and their teachings had not yet taken shape, much less taken control of the Jewish community. Rather, a number of groups competed for the highest levels of power and influence within the Jewish communities in Judea, Galilee, and beyond, among whom the most prominent were priests, members of the Herodian family, and Pharisees who survived the destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew's Gospel testifies to the ferment in the Jewish community in the wake of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The scribes, Pharisees, priests, and elders in the narrative symbolize Matthew's late 1st century opponents. Though the precise identity of these community leaders is hard to establish, some of the specific items in Yahshua's disputes with the scribes and Pharisees suggest that they represent the emerging rabbinic leadership that gradually gained power over the Jewish community during the next few centuries. The contents and development of the Mishnah, the earliest compilation of rabbinic law edited at the end of the 2nd century, suggests that in the years following 70, the rabbis were a small group interested in preserving and reinterpreting the practice of Judaism without the temple. They were not community elite, as has traditionally been held, but most probably a coalition of scribes, Pharisees, priests, and landowners seeking to define Judaism in new circumstances. in the late 1st century. This early rabbinic coalition, based at Yavne or Jamnia, was a reform movement within the larger Jewish community, just as Matthew's group was. They and Matthew were rivals for influence and access to power in the assemblies and other institutions of the Jewish community in or near Galilee. These reform movements sought not to form new sects, but rather to assemble disparate groups and forms of Judaism into one fold. At this stage, neither group was dominant in the Jewish community as a whole, but in Matthew's city or area, the rabbinic group's program was more influential than Matthew's Yahshua-centered Judaism. Matthew's rancor against the leadership indicates that they, not he, had been successful in attracting most of the people of the Jewish community to their reform program. We don't know where the Gospel of Matthew was written. Because it is written in Greek, the author must have been in a city large enough to have Greek-speaking population and a substantial Jewish community, some members of which were followers of Yahshua. Antioch on the Orontes in northern Syria is the location most often put forward, though without much supporting evidence. Matthew's city might have been in Galilee. Sepphoris or Tiberias would do well, or in an area contiguous with Galilee, like Transjordan, the Mediterranean coast, or southern Syria. Any city within or close to Israel is a likely location for Matthew and for his opponents, the early rabbis, who were based in Galilee. This location fits the narrative about Yahshua too. Matthew places his home in Capernaum and most of his work in Galilee. Good-sized cities such as Sepphoris and Tiberias, or even Capernaum and Bethsaida, had both Jewish and Gentile Greek speakers, as well as the social resources to educate and support leaders and writers like the author of Matthew. And if not Galilee, one of the surrounding cities or the Jewish community, such as Caesarea or Tyre on the coast, or Gerasa in Transjordan, would fit the social setting as described in Matthew's Gospel. Galilee and its neighbors, with their complex and cosmopolitan society and tightly woven cultural and commercial networks, could easily have supported the nascent rabbinic Jewish and Christian Jewish movements, as well as the other apocalyptic, priestly, messianic, revivalist, and revolutionary currents then running through society. The Gospel of Matthew reflects an uneasy tension concerning how to interpret biblical law, and it contains justifications for particular interpretations of Jewish tradition against those of other Jewish groups. Against the program of emerging rabbinic Judaism, the author of Matthew sought to establish and legitimate his form of Christian Judaism by a two-pronged attack. 1. A detailed and lengthy exposition of his outlook and way of life, comprising the bulk of the Gospel, and 2. A polemical denigration of his opponent's Jewish thought and practice. Now, it's the latter that we find in chapter 23, a denigration. Matthew then attacks a rival Jewish group, another group striving for leadership of the community, in his polemic against the Scribes and Pharisees in chapter 23. He doesn't deny the fundamental legitimacy of Israel, its law, or its community structures. To do so would be to destroy the basis of his own claim to legitimacy. Rather, he seeks to undermine the legitimacy of a certain group of Israel's leaders by attacking their personal integrity and the accuracy of their interpretations of Jewish law and divine will. The Seven Woes, with their mocking of Jewish practices and exaggerated accusations leveled against Jewish authorities, are an attempt to delegitimate those leaders and their teachings in the eyes of the whole Jewish community. The 7 statements in Matthew 23 are woe oracles, a literary form frequently found in the prophetic literature, either singly or in a series. The woe, that is, woe is he who, is usually followed by a description of the wrongful action or by a negative characterization of the antagonist. Appended to the woe may be a variety of rhetorical questions, threats, and so on. A woe oracle is a mild form of curse that functions as a public denunciation. In fact, in the scholar's translation of the New Testament, the translator actually translates the woes as damns. Damn you Pharisees! Damn you scribes! Matthew's 7 indictments of the Scribes and Pharisees are not a random selection of complaints, but a structured series of charges aimed at key aspects of their program and leadership role in the Jewish community. The first 2 woes concern competition for followers. According to Matthew, the Jewish leaders prevent their fellow Jews from following Yahshua's teachings and from attracting Gentiles to their Christian Jewish way of life in the Jewish community. It's hard for me even to call them Christian Jews, because at that time there was no such thing as Christian. When we say Christian, we think about Christians today in their churches. What Christian is today is like what Christian was then in no way. This frustrates the major goals of Matthew's group, who wish to teach the lost sheep of the house of Israel and all nations to follow Yahshua's teaching. Matthew charges that his rivals' teaching frustrate Elohim's purpose embodied in Yahshua's message of the kingdom of heaven. The next 3 woes, which are concerned with oaths, tithes, and purity, attack prevailing interpretations of the Torah, economy, and customs that hold the Jewish community together and give it identity and coherence. Oaths and vows are assumed and permitted in the Bible and are common in most cultures as a means of defining public social relationships, economic contracts, and judicial proceedings. Both the Jewish and Greco-Roman authors expended great effort in preserving the sanctity and seriousness of oaths, preventing people from swearing frivolous oaths or from making imprudent vows, and distinguishing valid from invalid vows and oaths. Matthew satirizes distinctions between some valid and invalid oaths and vows. His radical solution is to forbid oaths, Matthew 5:33, and then avoid the whole problem. This kind of suggestion is typical of a new, enthusiastic group characterized by close relations with one another and personal commitment. In the 4th and 5th woes, Matthew addresses the value of paying tithes to the temple and its priesthood and of preserving ritual purity in the consumption of food. They are important, but not as important as other things. Both tithes and purity are mandated by the Bible, so Matthew can't forbid them outright, since his opponents stress them as a special mode of fidelity to Elohim and the temple, even after the temple was destroyed. However, Matthew emphasizes other parts of the tradition and ridicules his opponent's priorities. The appropriateness of contributing tithes to the temple, even tithes of herbs, is affirmed but subordinated to, quote, the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy, and faith, unquote. The ritual cleanliness of cups and plates remains a valid concern, but it's subordinated to the cleansing of the inner self from extortion and intemperance. Matthew's distinction of inner and outer, and his distinction of more and less important laws, unfairly caricatures law-observant Jews who differ from him. He proposes justice, mercy, and faith as central criteria for group membership, ignoring, just as politicians often do today, the fact that all first-century Jewish sects and movements supported these virtues in their own ways. The Pharisees and early rabbis stressed the purity laws as a way of articulating Israel's sanctifying relationship with Elohim and supporting the community's commitment to justice, mercy, and faith. Matthew rejects his opponent's interpretation of their common tradition. The last 2 woes bring the attack to a climax by accusing the established leaders of bad faith and lack of integrity, and by calling them lawless murderers. The 6th woe continues the contrast between inner and outer mentioned in the 5th woe by comparing scribes and Pharisees to the beautiful outside and the corrupt inside of tombs. The accompanying charge of lawlessness against the scribes and Pharisees, who interpret, create, and promote a distinctive set of Jewish laws, is a deeply ironic attack by the author of Matthew. They are accused of lawlessness because, in the eyes of the Matthean group, they don't discern and act on the true will of Elohim. The seventh woe picks up the tomb imagery of the sixth and accuses the scribes and Pharisees of building tombs to the prophets and martyrs for whose death they, according to Matthew, were responsible. The charge of killing the prophets leads to a final warning of imminent judgment in verse 36. Matthew's vitriolic tone and detailed accusations strongly indicate that he is attacking the Jewish leaders in his city. Matthew attacks them in order to legitimate his own teaching and status and delegitimate theirs in the eyes of his followers and the whole Jewish community. The construction of this long and sophisticated attack was probably occasioned by the expulsion of Matthew's group from a local Jewish assembly, or in Greek, synagogue, meaning assembly. Expulsion didn't mean that Matthew's group was no longer Jewish, but that the conflict intensified. Matthew formed a new assembly, ecclesia, another word for assembly in Greek. As leader of the assembly, he continued to seek recognition for his understanding of Jewish life and tradition. Because of this conflict over authority, and because of their differing understandings of Jewish tradition, the author of Matthew doesn't fairly or sympathetically present the Pharisees and scribes. All the scribes and Pharisees are grouped together as a symbol for Matthew's opponents in the late 1st century. Historically, scribes were found at every level of society and didn't form a cohesive group. Some of them were surely officials and teachers and thus had contact and conflict with Yahshua. The Pharisees had a program to reform Jewish society and had won influence and sometimes power in society since the Hasmonean period. The author of Matthew does accurately portray the scribes as lower-level officials who would have interacted with Yahshua, and the Pharisees as a reforming group who also would have interacted with a deviant group of Jews who followed Yahshua, that is, the Matthean community, in the late 1st century. Neither the Pharisees nor the Matthean community was in control of society. The Roman government, the chief priests and families in Jerusalem, and Herod Antipas in Galilee had that role. The Pharisees did have some power, influence, and status, which they sought to preserve by receiving public honor and titles, and by controlling the interpretation of community customs and justice. In these activities, they probably had negative encounters with the early followers of Yahshua. The author of Matthew, however, evaluates the scribes and Pharisees as bad guys, like Pharaoh in Exodus. The repeated use of the pejorative epithets like hypocrite and blind besmirches the morality of the scribes and Pharisees, undermines their authority, and leads to the ironic charge that they are lawless, the very opposite of what they claim to be and probably were. The accusation that they are murderers of the prophets and the righteous seeks to explain and condemn their opposition to Matthew's group. The eschatological threat of judgment in verse 36, the lament over Jerusalem in verses 37 through 39, and the eschatological discourse, or Olivet discourse of Matthew 24 and 25, all invoke Elohim's judgment as the final resolution of the conflict. Note 3 concrete limits of even this intemperate polemic. The author of Matthew disputes with particular leaders rather than attacking all Jews without distinction, unlike many later anti-Jewish diatribes. Second, Matthew argues with his opponents about concrete laws and customs, not about law or legalism in general, or about vague charges of inferiority or decadence. Finally, although the author of Matthew invokes divine judgment on his opponents, he doesn't call for their deaths, much less cause their deaths. And yet, Matthew's attacks overflowed their limited and concrete boundaries all too easily. Just a few decades later, Christian writers charged all Jews with lack of integrity, rebellion against Elohim, and deicide. They rejected the law as a punishment reserved for sinful Jews, claimed the rest of the Bible for Christianity, and anointed themselves as God's chosen people. Matthew didn't make such claims, but his rhetoric was quickly recruited for new purposes. The contemporary success of Matthew's polemic can be measured by the modern English use of the word Pharisaic to mean hypocritical. As many have noted with distaste in recent years, Matthew's anti-Jewish rhetoric is dangerous and needs careful interpretation in a post post-Holocaust world. His rhetoric is harsh and certainly not a model for Christian charity. And here lies the problem posed earlier. How can Matthew be so contradictory? He teaches love of enemies, yet calumniates his own opponents as killers. Historically speaking, the gospel author was following the conventions of his time in calumniating and misrepresenting his opponents, even as he taught love of enemies as an instruction from Yahshua. But this isn't the full answer. The gospel itself contains hints of a possible solution, even if the author of Matthew doesn't see it. Careful study of chapter 23 reveals that the author focuses his attacks with precision on the Jewish community leaders, taking issue with laws, leaders, and institutional structures that threaten his views and practices. He seeks to delegitimate established Jewish leaders from whom he has broken. He wants to establish his own legitimacy as an authentic interpreter of Elohim's will. He doesn't attack all Jews, nor does he oppose them for being Jews. After all, he's a Jew himself. He disagrees with many of his fellow Jews concerning Elohim's will, Yahshua's role in relation to Elohim, and numerous other Jewish practices and understandings of the tradition. He argues with his fellow Jews on the basis of a shared heritage. In this, the author of the gospel distinguishes himself from those Christians of the next 1900 years who reject and condemn Jews generally, as well as their covenant with Yahweh. I might add here that it seems that whenever a leader leaves a group or is expelled from a group today, that leader always turns out castigating those of his former group who were leaders and attempting to reveal their sins in an attempt to bring themselves more esteem and further their distance from the group that they left or that left him go. Religious disagreements inevitably lead to sharp exchanges, that's for sure, which easily threaten the integrity of both parties. Authentic religious disagreements between Christians and Jews, however, will faithfully preserve the shared core of biblical tradition and will honor the integrity of each community with its practices and beliefs, even in the face of competing claims and non-negotiable differences. And what of a final resolution of the conflict? That, too, is answered by the common tradition. Elohim, not humans, provides the ultimate resolution of human confusion, suffering, and evil. Now let me add one thing that came to me as I was editing this essay, and that is, what prophets did the Scribes and Pharisees murder? The biblical prophets were long before there were Pharisees. To answer this question, we've got to go to the 1st century BC and perhaps even part of the 2nd century BC. To learn the history of the Pharisees, we have to turn to the 1st century BC and maybe the 2nd century BC to look back at the history of the Pharisees and determine who Matthew is talking about when he speaks of prophets being murdered by scribes and Pharisees. That's something I'm going to look into because I have read that history, and certainly there are prophets there that we basically don't know about because we don't understand the history of Judaism between the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. That is a great little essay from the late Anthony Saldarini from Bible Review Magazine, 1997, volume 13.2. You have been listening to Jackson Snyder Presents on Hebrew Nation Radio.